Alrighty, the Mr. McMahon Netflix documentary, episode 4, which is called Attitude. And I wonder what this is about. I mean, obviously it's the rise of the Attitude Era and how they were able to combat WCW. Now, as I said in my review for episode 3 of the McMahon documentary, this story, if you've been following the business, even if you started watching after the Attitude Era, they have covered it so much in so many different documentaries. Dark Side of the Ring's covered a lot of this themselves, including the Owen Hart stuff, which is near the end of this documentary. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. There have been numerous WWE pieces on it. You know, the Monday Night War series, the Attitude Era documentary. There have been interviews, the Steve Austin documentary. Like, a lot of these stories to wrestling fans, we know it like the back of our hand. I mean, they on this episode, they covered the rise of Austin. They covered the rise of the Mr. McMahon character because they picked up after the Montreal Screwjob and how that birthed the character. The rise of The Rock and DX and sort of that whole, you know, the nucleus of what would become the Attitude Era. And they didn't really go into how they were beating WCW after that, but they did talk about how, well, a little bit they did, but a lot of it was they had their backs against the wall and they had to change. Again, this story's been told time and time again, and oftentimes the story is told with some things that aren't 100% true. Now, I'm not saying that people are lying, but because it was so long ago, I do tend to see that a lot of these people genuinely forget. You have to remember, people like Vince McMahon and Bruce Pritchard have been working in this business since for Vince, since the 70s, for Bruce, since the 80s, and they're also older guys. And I'm not saying that to defend them, I'm making a point. There's a part in the documentary where they talk about the Austin 316 promo, and then Bruce kind of regurgitates the same story WWE's told for years, which is the next night on Raw, there were Austin 316 signs everywhere. And that is not true. That is not how it happened. There were a few signs early on, and as the weeks went by, it began to build and build and build. It snowballed. But the way it's edited is they show scenes of the Austin 316 signs everywhere, but clearly those scenes were from 97 and 98, not 96. So there's editing on this episode that actually bothered me. There's a specific one I'm going to get to later on that actually bugged the hell out of me. Now, again, I understand that Mr. McMahon is by no means a babyface. He's not. And I understand that this documentary, we knew it was going to be a hit piece, and I'm not in any way saying I feel bad for Vince. But there is some editing stuff here that I want people to be aware of going into it, because some of you guys might not know this. Number one, you might not know, and that's okay, because I was around during those days, and I also study this stuff, and that's okay if you don't know. And number two, it's more so the fact that I think it's, when you edit something a certain way, right, it's very manipulative. And I'm going to get to it in just a moment. But a big focus was stories we've heard before. Like I said, when The Rock heard Die Rocky Die as Rocky Maivia, he just turned heel. The Austin 316 promo that led to him eventually, being the top guy. The Mike Tyson stuff. This is stuff that has been talked about hundreds of times. There have been so many books written on this. There have been it's not any secret. It is not a secret to anybody, even if you're somewhat casual. But this documentary is made for people who either started watching wrestling way later, like in the 2010s, or people who just don't remember, or casuals. Even if you're somebody who browses the WWE Network / Peacock, there's already been many stories of this. So this is not for you. It's not for somebody like me. But I still want to review it because it's worth reviewing. This is worth talking about. And it's a big documentary. So it starts and ends with the Hart family. It starts with them showing the Montreal Screwjob and the consequences of it that led to the Mr. McMahon character. And the same thing they've always said, everybody wants to beat up their boss and that whole thing. The product got edgy. There was a few mentions of Sable and the TNA stuff they were doing, in that era. Not TNA the company, but TNA the body parts. And then in the latter half, they talk about Owen Hart, which is inevitable. And when you get to the Owen Hart stuff, look, Dark Side of the Ring covered the Owen Hart story in May of 2020, and that to me was probably the best biographical piece on not Owen Hart's life, but on that specific story and his death. There have been other biographies on Owen Hart's life, and I think A&E did one, and there's been documentaries on it, but nothing's going to top Dark Side of the Ring for me, and that was back when Dark Side of the Ring was just phenomenal, captivating TV. I think now they're kind of running out of stories, if I'm being honest with you. But I did a review here on the channel about the Owen Hart Dark Side of the Ring. And that, Jim Cornette crying, and they actually sort of examine, should they have stopped the show? Should they have not stopped the show? It was a crime scene. And in this documentary, they didn't go into that much detail because Dark Side of the Ring, I believe, was a two-parter, which is about 2 hours, if I remember right. I could be wrong about that, but I think it was about 2 hours. Whereas the Owen Hart stuff in this documentary was more like 20-ish minutes or so. So they don't go into as much granular detail on it. They don't. But it's a very weird back and forth because Vince himself says, because Bret, it's interesting, they play a Bret Hart interview from back then, and Bret Hart makes a point that, well, if Shane McMahon had been the one to fall and hurt himself in the ring and was dying, like literally passing away in front of the in the Kemper Arena, Vince would have stopped the show. And then Vince pretty much says, well, no, I would not have stopped the show if it was Shane or even me. And I don't know, man. It's a very weird thing. And the thing about pro wrestlers is a lot of these guys live in a very weird reality, separate from like people like you and I. And to them, a lot of them really do have that mentality of the show must go on. So some of the folks I was watching it with were like, well, what if Bret was working there and it wasn't Owen? What if it was like a Steve Blackman or like a different wrestler? What would Bret think? And that is a very good point. And I think if you ask Bret, if you ask him, he would probably say stop the show. But of course he's going to say that because this is his brother. This is his brother, his flesh and blood. But if you have like an alternate timeline where Bret was still in WWF, the same thing happened, was a different wrestler, would Bret have kept going? That's sort of the what if scenario because we're going back to 1999 Bret Hart, not 2024 or 2020's Bret Hart, because this was filmed mostly in 2021. So that was an interesting back and forth, and they sort of ended the documentary with this discussion of, are we going too far with what we're doing? Like the violence, the sex, did the Attitude Era push things too far? They actually briefly showed the controversy with the school principals who were complaining about kids mimicking wrestling. They did not talk about, and if you weren't around back then, you wouldn't know this, but there was a story where, and I was in high school when this happened, where a kid rock bottomed his kid's sister. I think his sister was like less than a year old or maybe 2 years old. Very small kid, an infant, and killed her. He rock bottomed her in the kitchen and killed her. And that was a huge story back then. And it was, Rock even talked about it in his book, if I remember correctly, the book he put out back then. I think he did. And so I remember that. And they did not talk about that, which I found interesting because that was a big thing. So the part about the editing manipulation that actually bugged me, it genuinely bugged me, was they showed like the Owen Hart tragedy, and then they were talking about, well, we just kept going after that. And then what they do is they show footage of the infamous Mick Foley bump off the Hell in a Cell. And I don't like that editing because if you're somebody who has never seen wrestling, or you weren't watching back then, or you don't have a familiarity with that time period, it's kind of manipulative editing. I don't like this. This is the one thing I'll say about this episode, is it pissed me off big time because I don't like manipulative editing, man. You would think that they did the Mick Foley thing after Owen Hart had died, and that's not what happened. The Mick Foley bump off the Hell in a Cell was in June of 98. Owen Hart died in May of 99. So the Mick Foley footage was a year prior, but they edited it into afterward, and I could just see somebody watching it just being horrified saying, oh, so they did that after one of their guys died from a fall from the top of the building? And they didn't. There were still some risky Mick Foley bumps, specifically if you want to go to an actual example, No Way Out 2000, but that bump was a bit more safe with the way they rigged the ring. But the infamous one that everybody remembers from the King of the Ring 98, that was shown after, and they didn't give context. And I don't like that. It's sort of like how in the previous episode, they had a shot of SummerSlam 95, and they said it was the house show the night before the first Nitro, and that's wrong. One of the things I did not talk about, that I wanted to talk about in the previous review, was the fact that they actually showed footage of Ted Turner watching the Billionaire Ted skits and laughing. Bischoff and others have talked about how this happened, but I did not know there was actual footage of it, so that put a smile on my face. I should have said that in my review. I didn't. I forgot all about it, but that was cool to see Ted Turner just literally laughing. Oh, that's supposed to be the Hulk. It was great. But, man, this episode, again, if you know the business and the story, nothing new. But if you don't, it could end up giving the wrong message. However, they were right to cover the Owen Hart thing because it was a headline story, and it's one that if they didn't talk about it, people would have been like, what about Owen Hart? Because remember, this was being made after Dark Side of the Ring, and I'm not sure if the producers of this show watched Dark Side of the Ring, but by that point, people had looked at the Owen Hart situation with a totally different lens. So what's scary is this episode ends with a bunch of footage, and the last thing they show is Chris Benoit. And I think that's where we're going in episode 5. Because that was, the Owen Hart death was an accident. And I'm not saying that to minimize it. It was a tragedy. The Benoit thing is really, that was a different level of, just tragedy. But we'll get there when we get there. So leave your comments down below. What do you think about episode 4 of the McMahon documentary? I'll see you guys in my review for episode 5. Take care.